by any means necessary.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today we're talking about the home stretch of the whittled down infrastructure bill. And we're happy to be joined for this conversation by Don DeBar, host of the Weekday World show on Radio Justice, LA. Don, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And Don, reportedly, the House will be set to vote finally on the reconciliation bill later on this week, a piece of legislation that was ideally designed to a lot of funding and resources for things that, frankly, millions of people in the United States need pretty badly at this point. It's certainly been something of a saga from its sort of original number of $6 billion all the way down to 3.5 and now first of all, it was 6 trillion down to 3.5 trillion and now down to 1.75 trillion. And I feel like there's a lot to be said. We've been covering it pretty closely here on the show, Don, but there's a couple of things that I've been thinking about, and number one, I mean, even how progressives who have been sort of the champions of the sort of fully fleshing out of the bill as much as possible have even sort of compromised on this. I mean, recently, Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, has said that they basically overwhelmingly voted to endorse in principle the entire Build Back Better Act that President Biden announced, that framework that he presented last week. She said, quote, "We appreciate the president's leadership and his commitment to getting this process over the finish line." And so, I mean, it seems that even the forces that we may have expected to hold out on this have gone along with how things are. And another thing that really kind of gets me, Don, is what the Democrats didn't do in order to basically force Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin to support the bill as it was. I mean, they could have, removed them from their committee assignments, which is a major thing for senators. I mean, they could have cut them off from campaign funds, rejected any legislation. There were just a number of things that could have taken place to basically get this bill where it needed to be. That just didn't happen. And, as we may be finally seeing this thing voted on once and for all in its considerably reduced state, Don, I'm just wondering how you're considering it all.
Well, the first thing is, there's a couple of items of context that are necessary. No one has a copy of the bill outside of some members of Congress, I assume, anyway, and hopefully all of the members of Congress and those connected to various agencies in the government who are the moving parts that someone has to be both taking information from and also analyzing in context as they interact. You're going to take $3.5 trillion, for example, and have an impact. I mean, you're talking about $10,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. It's a considerable piece of change. And if you're going to move that much activity around the economy, and you're going to involve, every federal agency in it, presumably the moving parts in that equation are all informed about your intentions so they can give you feedback that'll help you understand how these different things will interact. I doubt that's happening, but you would think someone actually doing this responsibly would do that, and further be sharing the document with the public at the head end, so we could be putting input into in other words, $10,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. How much of it do you think you're going to get? How much am I going to get? Probably very little. And so that money's going somewhere. Then we ask ourselves, where does it actually go? Forget all the hubbub about it's going to go into this program or that program or whatever. We know $1.2 trillion is going to go into the military between the Pentagon and the Veterans Administration. Off the top, out of whatever they spend next year, that much goes in, whether it's in this bill or outside of it, however they end up constructing their budget for next year. And so, if you think about the aggregate economic activity going on in the country, from people buying food to producing it to shipping it to refrigerating it to distributing it and every other product that people consume, housing and everything else that are essential to them, a quarter to a third of it is spent on the military. And that is half of the global military. It's 3 times what China spends, only instead of sharing it across 350 million people, they're sharing it across 1.8 billion. So the load on the individual members of that society is maybe 1/30th of what it is here. So, as they fight over, and I got to say one more thing, the designation of the 2 bills, there's the physical infrastructure, or whatever term they're using for the infrastructure bill, and then the human infrastructure bill. It reminds me of something. My wife was a HR executive or executive assistant, really, at a large multinational corporation before she passed. And in the 90s, that corporation started to change the designation on the books of their employees from human resources to something else that essentially was a classification of them, literally for tax purposes, as furniture.
Wow.
Now, you go back to this concept in our law, going back to the Romans even, but certainly through the period of chattel slavery. Chattel, in the term chattel slavery, that comes from the Roman, where the etymology of it is basically head, as in head of cattle. And that's how these mega corporations 20, 30 years ago were looking at their employees. And so when someone says human infrastructure, I'm seeing it through the prism of that history. And these people are the product of those corporations, of course. That's who put them in power. So, I'm hoping everyone that has need in this country, and we're talking, there's a 99% that has some needs. I personally, for example, as a homeowner, am looking at this, SALT part of the bill, where they're going to allow people to deduct their local taxes again. There are issues around that, but just in terms of actual relief, millions of people would find relief there. But there are some people that the relief they need is a roof over their head and where their next meal is coming from, or relief from hundreds of thousands of dollars of tuition over their back, or medical bills, or some insulin that they can't afford. And, at the end of the day, after they get another $3.5 trillion, there's still going to be millions of people without that. And so it's hard for me to take this whole process seriously.
Yeah, Don, and I appreciate your framing of the phrase human infrastructure, and that's going to make me stop using it. So I really do appreciate that a lot, because I certainly hadn't thought of it that way. But I think most people hadn't thought of it that way. But I know that these politicians absolutely do. And especially when I look at the things that Joe Biden has said about people like Joe Manchin, who, Manchin has made it clear that he just really does not care about people in his own state, let alone people around the rest of the country who are facing the kind of hardships that you just very simply laid out, that we all understand that we are, facing. But, you have Biden saying at an event in Baltimore last week, he said this publicly now, that Joe Manchin is not a bad guy. He's a friend. And it's hard to argue that Biden hasn't been treating Manchin like a friend since he's agreed to his demands. Manchin and Sinema and the industry lobbyists that they are acting on behalf of, just doing what they want, cutting this budget down to practically nothing for the people. So, what do you think that reflects upon in regard to how Biden sees these politicians like Joe Manchin, as opposed to how Biden and the Democrats in general see the people that they, practically bullied into voting for them to get rid of Donald Trump, because Biden was supposed to be so much better than Trump?
Well, let's look at his personal history. Okay, he's the senator from Delaware, of course, since 1973 up until he became vice president January 20th, 2009. And then was vice president until January 20th, 2017. And, he's basically was the senator from the state in the United States that is the tax haven and corporate haven. If you have a large corporation and you want to keep certain things about that corporation's operations secret from the public, Delaware is the state to incorporate in. If you're a large corporation and you want to avoid paying taxes, Delaware is the state that you incorporate in. And Joe Biden is largely responsible for the tax policy of the United States as with respect to how Delaware is able to handle it. In other words, how can Delaware operate as a tax shelter from federal taxes? Biden has been running interference for them since the tax structure changed in this country from what existed when Nixon was in office until up to what we have now. So in terms of his actual concern for people and taking a chunk of money out of corporate America to feed people here, he's one of the architects of the present condition. And so I don't take what he's saying about it seriously at all. I know his history. However, one thing one might do looking at the picture, forgetting all of these characters, is what tools are available to someone that actually wanted to feed, clothe, and shelter everyone in the country at some minimum where they could live with a measure of dignity, knowing the money is there. The money passes through that damn Capitol building every year to do all of that and throw a big chunk of money, by the way, at the people who need that around the world. And it doesn't happen, but people get really, really rich, like corporations we've seen turn into trillion-dollar corporations over the last 10 years. What would you do? You go on television and you say to people who are really hungry and in desperate straits across the country, I'm going to fix that. Here's a program that we want to first find out what you need and then give it to you. Here's the money we're going to spend, and here's what we're spending it on. And then you chop the military budget down to 10% over the size of China's, for example, which means you would cut about $600 billion a year to $700 billion a year out of it. And then you sit down and you start making deals like they've been doing behind closed doors for the last, months or whatever. That would be a start. They're never going to go there. From there, it's a difficult process. But if you're not even doing that, then you're not trying to solve that problem.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I tend to agree. And I mean, when we have a look at, all of those material conditions that you're just speaking to, Don, and how people are just, I think, literally seeing their conditions worsen more and more as time goes on. And, we're also in the midst of a strike wave here in the United States, ongoing issues with, things like racist police terror and things like that. I mean, with all of this sort of swirling around and impacting people, when we look at the sort of social, political, and economic reality inside the United States right now, and how the Democrats, the current party in power right now, have basically refused to really respond to that in a material way, in the sense that I think a lot of people sort of expected, or certainly what I think a lot of people were made to feel that they would have coming after 4 years of Trump, I think puts the U.S. in a kind of a precarious situation in a number of ways, as, those sort of far-right Trumpist elements, I think, are really just sort of chomping at the bit to try to come back into power. And I think at this point seem to be in a fairly good position to do so. I mean, we have no crystal ball about what will happen in the 2022 midterms or the 2024 presidential elections. But I just feel like the Democrats are not maneuvering in a way that is instilling a lot of confidence in the elements of the United States that it always seems to rely on to achieve electoral victory, while consistently not doing much for. And so it just feels like, in reality, I mean, not only are the Democrats sort of seemingly contributing to what we on the show here call the sort of rot that has set in the United States, but in a way seem to be setting the stage possibly for their own sort of political defeat in a number of levels here in the coming years, if something drastic isn't done.
I mean, there's a lot in there. I don't know if there's time for me to get to all of it, but one thing I just like to remind you of is the history of the person, the president that we have now on particular, let's say, the subject of racism. I'm remembering when Boston was having, uprisings over school busing. and there were people that were it was a hugely divisive issue. Racists were against busing. There were others who were against it for other reasons, but racists took that side and inflamed it. And Biden was where the side of the line that he was on was clearly with the racists in that subject matter, and he even used language, barely symbolic language, really stuff that my creative writing teacher in high school would put a mark next to it and say lacks subtlety or whatever if I used the terms in describing what busing was going to do and the dangers to the kids that were being bused from white neighborhoods to black neighborhoods would see. He is not a remedy to Trump. And there are, people, in this society, people define someone that supports Trump as a racist. And that's not necessarily true. Not that there aren't racists that support him, but there are others that supported him too. And yet Biden, no matter where he fits in that, has been consistently, in terms of public policy and pronouncements, a racist. And so he's not going to come in on a steed and rescue us from someone like Trump on that issue. And that's something that people don't really have any clarity on in the public discourse in general and in their understanding of the political machinations and the political dynamics in this country. And that's something that's a real dangerous vulnerability that we have. If we can't see that, what can we see?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. But I think it's an even stronger point that a lot of people, I think, Don, don't want to face when it comes to not, Biden, in regard to Biden and the Democratic Party in general, but the Progressive Caucus. At least this is where I'm looking, because, the Progressive Caucus was supposed to be the bulwark against the establishment Democrats doing exactly what they're doing. And I'm wondering, how you are feeling about how people are seeing the Progressive Caucus and their effectiveness at being that bulwark. Do you think they were effective at all in at least raising the issue of the duplicity of the Democratic establishment in this situation? And do you think that their standing has changed in the perspective of the people who, I think, put a lot of hope into them that they would be able to push the Democrats to do better than this?
Well, first of all, I don't think their role is actually the one that's set. I'm stuck with this perspective as a Marxist that when I look at things to try to understand them, one thing I try to be clear on, even if I'm not in each case because of the nature of them, there's a difference between the appearance of something and what it actually is, appearance and essence, the real and the virtual, whatever. What they say and how they're portrayed and all of that is a lot of hogwash, and what they actually do is all that they are. In terms of politicians and in terms of people in a social mode in general, you are what you do, okay? And you may also be what you are potentially and what you might do, but you are what you do, period. The rest of it, descriptive stuff, is language nonsense. These guys do not need to point out to the population that they are in dire straits, and they don't need to point out to the population that the Democrats are duplicitous. Most of us know both of those things in our guts because we're living it. And so they need to be trying to do something more. Now, there are ways, even as a minority, to wield power by wielding it at the margins. None of them are doing any of the, using any of the tools that are available like that. As an example of that, I'll say the biggest failure to do that was the Green parties when Ralph Nader was blamed for the loss of the White House in the year 2000. Rather than claiming that, whether it was true or not is another matter. Rather than claiming that and turning to the Democrats in front of the whole world and saying, and you know what? We're going to do it again and again and again until you start adopting this policy, that policy, and that policy of ours. That's what the Right to Lifers did back in the 80s and the 70s even, that flipped the entire forward motion of the society here politically over the last 30, 40 years. And it is very possible to do. Certainly, it's worth trying, and none of them are even doing that. And so it tells me what they're really about. They may look like they're doing this, but I can see what they're actually doing.
Definitely. Well, we thank you so much, Don, for joining us today. We're going to leave it there. We'll move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.